Greetings all, Alexander von Marshall speaking, editor-in-chief of the Warden Post and your host at MetaVisions, the playground of dangerous ideas and the official podcast channel of the Warden Post. Today I have the immense pleasure, privilege and honor to welcome to our show Dr. Jason Jorjani. Jason, welcome. Glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alex. Thanks for the invitation.
The pleasure is all mine. On this side, it has been a conversation brewing for a while, so now we'll have some time to touch some relevant issues in regards to your own work and how your work relates on contemporary issues on metapolitics, politics, and the philosophical discourse we find ourselves. So before we go, I just want to say that I deeply and profoundly admire your work and Prometheus and Atlas, and especially World State of Emergency, have been a profound influence on determining the course I'm taking the Warden Post as a project.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing to finally have a philosophical background, Jason, where we can actually leave the archaic romanticism notion of the right and to look forward.
Well, I'm sure plenty of people would consider me a romantic, but I am at least as futuristic as I am archaic. So yeah, it's definitely a response to the traditionalism that's dominant on the right.
Right. And do you care to share a few words about your latest project and your latest engagement with New Prometheanism? Because it's something fresh, and I think that our viewers would be more than happy to get engaged into it, to listen something more about it.
Sure. So you mentioned Prometheus and Atlas and World State of Emergency. I have been working on a book that will be released by Arctos in September called Prometheism, which in a way you could consider a synthesis of the projects of Prometheus and Atlas on the one hand and World State of Emergency on the other. It forwards that trajectory in my thinking. And I have distilled a manifesto from out of this book that is going to be released in September. And viewers can find that manifesto, the Prometheus Manifesto, on a new website that I've launched, prometheism.com, like Prometheus and theism. Prometheism.com has the manifesto for this movement that I'm launching with the book, the movement Prometheism, which I hope to elaborate on throughout the course of our conversation.
That's absolutely amazing. I will be sure to include a reference to the website for the viewers later. So in case someone will be watching the episode later, he will be able to go directly to the link and get familiar himself with the paradigms and the values being exposed there. I would want to touch on the subject more in detail. What's the idea behind it, Jason? Should that be an intellectual platform for a further elaboration of ideas, or does it have the tendency to become a massive popular movement in terms of turning the cultural tides?
Yeah, no, I do not expect it to become a populist movement. The ideas in the manifesto, and even more so, the ideas in the book, are aimed at an intellectual vanguard, and they have the objective of organizing and focusing the energies of basically the intellectual leadership of the metapolitical movement that I think is required to transform our society. So, I don't expect Prometheism as I don't know if you want to call it an ideology, to be something that will be directly processed by the masses, but it can lead to more populist enterprises on the part of various intellectuals, not only on the right, but I think in an increasingly dissident left that's upset with identity politics and that thinks this emphasis on cultural relativism and so forth is a betrayal of even the Marxist project. So one of the things about the Prometheus Manifesto that I think will be clear to your viewers if they read through it is that there are as many ideas in it that are traditionally associated with the radical left as there are ideas in it that are characteristic of the far right. It really stakes out a position beyond the left-right political dichotomy.
So basically, we're talking about a platform which has the potential to transcend the typical dualistic approach and the division between right and left, and basically offer us a certain platform for us to be able to head on face the challenges which the convergence or disasters Gulam Fa spoke about, or even your own world state of emergency.
Yeah, so as you suggested at the outset of our conversation, there is a certain archaic, traditionalist attitude or approach that's dominant on the right. And I think that this approach fundamentally fails to grapple with the most significant challenge that we are facing in our time and that we will face over the coming generation, namely the convergence of certain advancing technologies on what has been dubbed the singularity. So in this manifesto, I talk about genetics, robotics, information, and nanotechnology converging in ways that challenge the fundamental parameters of human existence. They call into question human existence as such. And I think that the traditionalist right has only been able to face this prospect of a technological singularity with a kind of reactionary will to put the brakes on everything. And I described this position fairly precisely and in detail in the book, and it's alluded to as well in the manifesto as a position that you could characterize as the will toward a breakaway civilization. In other words, a group of people with resources that extend from the military into associated industries and the intelligence community, who would adopt the traditionalist mindset, would be inclined to engineer the collapse of industrial civilization and basically push us back toward a feudal and neo-agrarian society while maintaining a monopoly on advanced technologies themselves and using them only in very restricted and limited ways. So I think that if the traditionalist right were able to actually exert influence over the military, industrial, and intelligence complex to a greater extent than they've been able to thus far during the Trump administration, if that were to happen sometime in the next 20 to 30 years as we approach the technological singularity, the response would be a very regressive one. Basically, we would wind up with a scarcity economy, and I think that this whole discourse of deep ecology and so forth would be used in order to deindustrialize the planet, and that's something that I am calling for us to resist. At the same time, I think that a certain affirmation of tradition and heritage is necessary in order to take control of the transformative forces of these advancing technologies. And in particular, I'm pointing people back toward the Promethean ethos that I think has been uniquely characteristic of Western civilization since its inception in classical Greece. So my project is one of consciously affirming and appropriating the archetype of Prometheus as the driving force of technological advancement so that we can more deliberatively and less blindly use these advancing technologies as forces for positive social transformation rather than being possessed by them and being subjected to dehumanizing instrumentalization at their hands.
And Jason, what's your opinion? Why do you think that so many people on the new right or the dissident right use whichever expression you would fancy using, finds themselves into this trap of archaic forms of not only political activism, but the perception of reality that technology somehow this manifestation of social decomposition, and people are quite resisting towards embracing the technological changes. It's especially on the Christian-dominated side of right-wing politics. things like social engineering, which will eventually become our reality. In a way, it's obvious that it's an inevitable course of development. Why are people resisting change, and why can't we observe technology of something which can be utilized to improve the state of human existence? How did we come to that point?
Well, I think the response is actually quite understandable. It's a fear response because, frankly, many of these technologies are profoundly disturbing in their implications. I mean, they could be used for monstrous degradations of human existence. For example, it's possible now with CRISPR, the breakthrough that's been made with CRISPR in the field of genetic engineering, to start splicing human and animal genes. And one can imagine how, although this may be unlikely in the context of contemporary Western society, if you think of China, one can imagine how the splicing of human and animal genes could be used to, let's say, engineer into people who could function better under adverse environmental conditions. Like, for example, if we ever needed to mine the resources in Antarctica, there's considerable oil, for example, under the ice sheet in Antarctica that's just sitting there, inaccessible to us. And you can imagine genetic engineers taking the antifreeze gene from frogs, these frogs that freeze inside lakes, and then after months they thaw out and their heartbeat returns and they just come back to life. You can imagine taking this antifreeze gene from frogs and splicing it into the human genome to genetically engineer workers that could survive in polar or Antarctic conditions. And there's a whole variety of these possible chimerical degradations of human existence. Then there's cloning. The Chinese have a culture of ancestor worship, and I can well imagine that we could reach a point where they begin to clone successful political leaders, that a kind of permanent political elite develops in Chinese society as a result of the use of cloning on the basis of a Confucian value system. So, I mean, these are really disturbing uses of genetic engineering. And then when we come to nanotechnology, the situation is even more horrifying because, once you're dealing in robots that are engineered on a molecular scale and that are capable of reconstructing material on a molecular scale, well, of course, there are a wide variety of beneficial uses for this. It could be revolutionary in the medical industry, sending these nanobots to repair arteries or, to basically treat brain cancer, to literally eat away at brain cancer in sensitive areas of the nervous system, molecule by molecule. So there are a variety of positive uses to it. But, if molecular nanotechnology were to ever get out of hand, if there were ever to be, say, the equivalent of a computer virus inside a nanotechnological system, you could have these nanobots attack, matter in our environment, including the matter of the human body, and basically degenerate everything into what's commonly been called the gray goo by technologists. Even if we don't want to go that far, into such a radical possibility, imagine the surveillance implications of this. You could build drone insect robots using molecular nanotechnology that would have everyone under surveillance everywhere and be able to swarm attack individuals on command. And no one would be the wiser of who was really behind these stealth assassinations using nanotechnological drones. So my point is that the threats to personal privacy, to liberty, and even bodily integrity from these technologies are so great that they really challenge the system of crime and punishment, of law and order that we've had for centuries. And in the absence of any reimagination of how our society ought to be structured, I can empathize with the fear on the part of traditionalists in the right who simply want to put the brakes on all of this and essentially see it as demonic.
That definitely makes sense when you put it in that way. That actually technological advancement, as Thomas Kuhn will describe it, takes an unprecedented accelerating space, and we don't have the necessary political paradigms in order to restrain it into a certain constructive and formative framework. But on the contrary, it becomes a disintegrational force. But in the same time, do you think that we can actually do that? Can we put brake on technological advancement and reevaluate our paradigms as societies in the West? And can putting the brake actually stall progress? Progress, when I say progress, I mean in the positive way, not in the leftist regressive way here, if that makes sense.
Of course, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. My intellectual trajectory is from out of the Italian futurists. It's only recently that progress has been appropriated and uniquely associated, appropriated by the left and uniquely associated with the left. And in fact, if you look at leftist politics today, which is all about identity, identity politics and cultural relativism and so on and so forth, it is it is really degeneratively anti-progressive. So yes, of course. As far as I'm concerned, the Italian futurists were the greatest progressives of the 20th century. But to go back to the substance of your question, yes, you could put the brakes on it. But here's the thing. If you look at, say, the rate of advancement in artificial intelligence technology, computer processing power, and the approach toward genuine, strong artificial intelligence, and also these technologies are mutually reinforcing. So the more computer processing power advances and the stronger AIs that we develop, the more there are going to be rapid breakthroughs in genetic engineering, because you're going to be able to correlate specific gene sequences with phenotypic characteristics and with things like IQ, say, right? So being able to identify the genetic correlates of certain human qualities and then manipulate them will be more and more possible the further that computer processing and artificial intelligence advances. And when you look at that rate of increase in processing power, you see that really we only have about 30 years until the technological singularity. Here I agree with somebody like Ray Kurzweil, which in general I disagree with profoundly. I think that the Kurzweil school of singularity thought or transhumanism is really facile, superficial, reductively materialistic, and so forth. However, I agree with them on the time scale. And if you consider that we only have 30 years until the technological singularity, that means that there's one way to put the brakes on all of this, and only one way. And that would be for a traditionalist worldview to win over certain people within the military intelligence industrial complex, particularly in the United States, but it is really a transnational phenomenon at this point. And these individuals would have to basically, as I suggested earlier, engineer catastrophes that precipitate a collapse of advanced industrial civilization. And you have to consider that it's not enough to simply slow the economy or slow the rate of technological progress or just actually even destroy the industrial base to produce certain technologies. You have to actually get rid of the knowledge base that leads to these technological developments. So what we're talking about would be the equivalent of the torching of the Library of Alexandria and the destruction of the higher intellectual culture of classical antiquity. And I find that an appalling prospect. So what I'm advocating with Prometheism is that within the next 30 years, we develop not only what you characterize as a political framework capable of handling the technological singularity, capable of allowing us to navigate through this singularity successfully and come out the other side of it stronger, but we need something much deeper than a political framework, okay? Because otherwise, we're going to wind up with totalitarianism. And that's only going to be effective for so long. Suppose we wanted to go the route of totalitarianism. Such a system will eventually collapse from the pressures from underneath, from beneath, and from inside it. It will implode. So I think what's really necessary is not just the development of a political framework, a kind of Prometheus constitutional order in a legal sense, but the cultivation of a Promethean ethos that would be the true constitution of such a society. You know, in World State of Emergency, I was really developing certain basic concepts of Carl Schmitt, who talks about how in a state of emergency or a state of exception, when the normal constitutional order has to be suspended, say in a hurricane or whatever natural catastrophe, or in a state of civil war, or if an enemy is invading the country, in any of these emergencies, or for example, the coronavirus pandemic, in any of these emergencies, the constitutional order may need to be suspended. So there is no explicit legal order functioning. And yet the sovereign, the president, or whatever body in a particular society has sovereign power, is governing on the basis of an occulted constitution, a hidden constitution, which is essentially the ethos or moral fiber of that society. Okay, the character of that society. And Schmitt argues that this is the true constitution, and the written constitution of a country is only a reflection of its deeper ethos, and sometimes, frankly, it may be a distorted reflection of that ethos, and may not be adequate to the ethos of a given society. So Prometheism is an attempt, first and foremost, to cultivate a Promethean ethos as the basis then for the explicit elaboration of a socio-political system that would be able to navigate the dangers of the technological singularity.
It absolutely makes sense from a constitutional point of view when you say that there is embedded ethos which will govern the decision-making processes of a certain elite in a given society. And then, of course, you have the written constitution, which is the outlining of the entire legal framework for the socioeconomic system. Could we speak about an exoteric political doctrine here and an esoteric one, which in a way is being nurtured by the elite in its own closed circle, in a way, where they
That's always a dangerous question to answer, because of course, if you're asking whether there's an esoteric doctrine, the whole point is that it's an esoteric doctrine, and you're asking it in an exoteric context. But yes, I think it'd be clear to anyone who's read any of my writings, particularly Prometheus and Atlas, that I'm an esoteric writer, and that there's a kind of facade and an exterior to my philosophical project, and then there's a deeper spiritual dimension that that famous maxim from the Gospels would apply to: he who has ears, let him hear. So yes, I think that's the case, and it's all the more important for the esoteric leadership of this movement to really embody the Prometheus archetype.
In terms of education, you might be familiar that recently the entire educational system established during the Enlightenment age and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, of course, which needed highly qualified people to be able to properly answer the challenges of the new modes of production which technological advancements has brought to society. There has been quite an interesting conversation about people discussing that we have to rehaul the educational system on a global network because it's not corresponding to our reality, right? What would be the idea behind the educational reform when we are talking about Prometheism?
I think that we need to go back to the canon, first of all. When you say global, in the initial phase of restructuring the educational system, because there has to be an emphasis on tradition, and here I align very closely with a lot of other people on the right, because there has to be an emphasis on tradition, and our tradition is, of course, only our heritage. You're not going to get the same educational reforms to take place in China, or certainly not in the Islamic world, although Iran could be an interesting exception. And so I would say the first step is a return to the canon. We need to inculcate our future generations with a sense of the intellectual and literary heritage of the West, beginning with the Greeks and going forward in a very clearly defined trajectory, which is not, taught to students as an arbitrary succession of, names and dates of personages and events, but is taught in a way that conveys a certain internal historical logic and teleology. Here's where I most definitely agree with Hegel and Heidegger, and I'm forwarding their project. There is a history of being that goes back to the pre-Socratics, to the pre-Socratic Greeks. And we need to, at various levels, on various rungs of the educational system, convey that inner historical logic of our civilization to students. And the other thing that I think, on the other hand, needs to be emphasized is practical application, and doing away with a lot of these bullshit disciplines that consist of word games and that are basically propagandizing for future participation in identity politics. And instead, we need to, while at the same time as we emphasize the canon and a solid grounding in the tradition of Western philosophy and literature and history and so forth, we also need to develop skills in students that are directly applicable to various fields and that will cultivate the capacities for them to make breakthroughs in the sciences and mathematics and these fields that are fueling the technological singularity. Because on a ground level, the kind of human beings, the kind of individuals who are working in these laboratories, at Carnegie Mellon and MIT and Google and whatever, in order to develop nanotechnology and artificial intelligence, or who are working in genetic engineering laboratories, the kind of moral is not a word I like to use, the ethical fabric of those individuals is going to be very significant in determining how these technologies are applied and in what way they are either integrated into society or wind up posing serious threats to our society. So yeah, we need a greater emphasis on practical skill, and I think, for example, there's a lot of bullshit, frankly, going on right now in theoretical science, in physics. There are a lot of theories, like some of these elaborations of string theory, that are not testable. They're bad metaphysics. They're just bad metaphysics. And so I think that a view to technological application should be used as a litmus test or criterion, even for theoretical science, so that a lot of time and energy is not wasted elaborating theories that have no practical application. Let's put it that way. I don't want to say that they're not in touch with reality, because one of the things that you'll see if you look at the Prometheus manifesto is that I critique the modern conception of reality, capital R. But certainly we can say there's a lot of theoretical work being done in physics departments at various universities that has no practical application.
In terms of course, there is a big difference in the research methodology between humanities and life sciences and generally the STEM, right? Do you genuinely believe that the cultural Marxist intelligentsia, right, which is dominating the humanities, do they exercise a certain level of influence into what's happening into life sciences, into technology, into IT, and so on, in terms of putting certain limitations like they're doing in, let's say, in legal theory, right, or even economics, which are always a hotbed of discussion, and people have had literally their academic careers being destroyed for criticizing the already established narrative. Do you believe
That's a very complex question. Very complex question. Let me take it step by step. First, with a remark about quote unquote cultural Marxism. I think this term is an insult to Marx. Marx was a revolutionary thinker who, even if you don't agree with his prescriptions about how society and the political order ought to be reorganized, at least he is a very valuable philosopher in terms of an analysis of capitalism and basically what I would call the motor of techno-scientific advancement. And I think that in a lot of ways, actually, Marx's analysis of industrial transformation, which is basically the advance of technoscience, and the alienating effects that this has, the ways in which it poses a fundamental challenge to human existence, is an analysis that lines up very closely with Heidegger, frankly. There's a lot of overlap between Marx and Heidegger, and some of your viewers may be surprised to know that in his youth, Marx actually accepted Prometheus as his personal god. In his love letters to his girlfriend, Jenny, he went on and on about how Prometheus was the patron saint of philosophy and the great martyr for human enlightenment and liberation. So I think there's a lot that can still be learned from Marx, and that he's in a trajectory of thinkers from Hegel through to Nietzsche and Heidegger. So yes, cultural Marxism, I would reject that, that category. I think that the identity politics that's being promulgated today is much more rootless than anything that deserves to be associated with Marx. But to go into the heart of your question, I'm not sure how much impact this discourse of identity politics and multiculturalism and cultural relativism has on people studying technology. And although, for example, Peter Thiel left Silicon Valley because he says he was frustrated by all the Kool-Aid drinkers who were uniformly against Trump, to the point where he couldn't even have a conversation with any of these people, I wonder to what extent this discourse really does pervade Silicon Valley. And of course, there we're looking at graduates of these programs in the sciences and technology at places like Carnegie Mellon and MIT and Princeton and so on and so forth, and Stanford. I think that this discourse is much less pervasive in the hard sciences and in technological fields than it is in the humanities. So I believe that with the right approach, we could actually win over a lot of people in Silicon Valley. And that's something that I am aiming to do with Prometheism. If the right is able to develop a discourse beyond regressive traditionalism and to be able to regain the kind of archaeofuturistic ethos that you see in Nietzsche, that the Italian futurists still expressed, then I think that a lot of people in high tech could be won over. And the reason for that is also because I'm not sure that these people are very keen on democracy. I think that there's an increasing tendency toward technocracy in Silicon Valley, that there's an inclination toward a governance based on competence, and that you could win a lot of these people over to something similar to Plato's ideas, albeit translated into contemporary context, about how people who are competent in various areas should be managing the domains of the government that are relevant to those areas. So, yeah, I would say that that's the case. Now, in the humanities, you're right. I mean, it's such a disastrous situation that I just don't even think that it's salvageable. And frankly, I'm concerned that we're going to face something similar to the collapse of the classical academies at the time of the institutionalization of the Catholic Church, and the barbarian invasions of Europe. It may be that the humanities departments are so degenerate at this point in universities across this country that they will basically have to be demolished, and we'll have to build new institutions from the ground up.
The reason why I asked the question is exactly the point which we made at the beginning of our conversation, Jason, when we said that we have to win over the certain strata inside the administrations of countries across the West, right? It's a really important question. If you have someone who, let's say, went to a certain field of study where he was systematically intellectually annihilated, right? And he was dogmatically indoctrinated into identity politics, right? How do you win that person through argument? Can you really have a philosophical discussion with someone who wants to have a religious Calvinist conversation? That's the question.
No. We have to sideline them. They have to be defeated, demoralized, and removed from anything like the levers of power. We just have to basically do an end run around them. And I think that the more acute the social crises become, and the more palpable this danger of the technological singularity becomes, and the more it comes into view as a challenge facing our society, these discourses that you find in the humanities will become increasingly irrelevant and ineffectual. And so, to a large extent, it's just a question of letting them wither and die on their own while we build new institutions.
You wrote about that extensively in a whole chapter in the World State of Emergency, right? When you put a special emphasis on human rights and how they don't correspond, right, as a international law conception and a philosophical conception in general to the reality now. So I do completely agree with you, because I have been trying to engage into debate with some of them people, and that's my conclusion. You can't have a debate with someone who wants to have a religious conversation. It's not possible. So I completely agree with you on the subject.
Definitely. Yes, I think we should not wait. We don't have a lot of time, Alex. We don't have a lot of time, and we should not waste our energy. So I think the people that are worthy of a dialogue right now, the people who we ought to invest in engaging in conversation, are the whole spectrum of people in the intellectual right, all the way from traditionalism to archaeofuturism to more fascistic futurism. All of these positions on the right, which are quite different from each other, libertarians, certain hyper-intellectual libertarians, people like, frankly, Peter Thiel, and I think Elon Musk as well. These people who have libertarian political leanings and are very intelligent and deeply dissatisfied with the status quo. These are people on the right that are worthy of engagement. And then I think we should also appeal to the dissatisfied Marxists, to the people on the radical left. Let's put it this way: people on the authentic left who are profoundly skeptical and wary of identity politics and see it as a betrayal of, frankly, the Marxist project, which, as I suggested initially, is in some senses a Promethean project. And so I think that the political solution to the impending challenge of the technological singularity will be one that is to the right of Mussolini and to the left of Marx. It is a point on the political spectrum that, well, think about it this way, that instead of a political spectrum that's a line, instead of a horizontal political spectrum, you have a kind of circle. And you got your left and your right, and then you have the moderate centrist that's between the left and the right. People like, I don't know, Hillary Clinton and John McCain, right, in the Democratic and Republican parties. Well, the position that I'm staking out with Prometheism is 180 degrees opposite to that. Instead of it being a compromise between the left and the right, being a moderate position, it is 180 degrees on the other side of the circle, beyond the far right and beyond the radical left. And if you were to ask me for historical precedents of that, I would name people like Plato, Nietzsche, Marinetti. So it's that kind of thinking that we need in order to save ourselves from some of the most catastrophic implications of this convergent advancement of technologies.
In a way, we need our own modern. We need something which comes post-modernity in a way, which will definitely make sense and which will, on one side, ensure our ethno-linguistic continuity as a culture and, of course, promise a certain sustainable future on the long run. Not only an ideological delusional thinking like the left and not the left. I agree with you. I will start reformulating myself. Identity politic radical ideologues, I would call them from now on, because that absolutely makes sense. In terms of discussing this transcendence of the right and the left, there have been certain intellectual titans like Alexander Dugin, Gulam Fa, of course, who already tried to find a point where transcending the traditional division between right and left makes sense. I consider your work to have a titanic importance, so it's really important to mention how does your ideas relate to archaeofuturism and the fourth political theory, to be more precise.
Yes. So first, archaeofuturism, because I want to say something a little more substantial about Dugin. So let's dispense with Guillaume first. It's funny. I discovered Arctos Press and submitted my manuscript for Prometheus and Atlas to them after Googling archaeofuturism because I wanted to coin the term. I wanted to coin a term to describe my thinking, archaeofuturism. So I Googled it. And this guy came up, Guillaume Fay, archaeofuturism. And I'm like, who the hell is this? What is this business? And I looked into it. I say, oh, Arctos Press. Who are these people? I looked through their catalog. And I decided it would actually be a good venue for Prometheus and Atlas. Unfortunately, it also meant that I couldn't coin the term archaeofuturism because somebody had already done it. But what Guillaume Fay means by archaeofuturism and the way in which my work is archaeofuturistic are actually quite different from one another. It seems to me, and I have not read Fay extensively, but from the topical understanding that I have of Fay's position, it seems to me that what he's talking about is using advanced technologies in order to redevelop a traditional society in a sustainable way. So to reaffirm our collective identity as a civilization and use advanced technologies in order to make a traditional way of life more feasible. It seems to me that that's what he's talking about, the integration of advanced technology with traditional ways of life. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean to embrace the most radical potentials of these singularity level technologies in ways that fundamentally transform human existence and bring about what Nietzsche called the Superman. I think that this reading that Nietzsche's Superman is only some kind of an ethical construct, that it's a certain ideal of a psychological type or something is profoundly mistaken. That's what Nietzsche meant by the higher man. The higher man is an overture to the Superman. Nietzsche elaborated a very sophisticated critique of Darwinian evolution, and he has a substantial view on the further evolution of Homo sapiens into a post-human condition that he refers to as the Übermensch. And I affirm that. So I think that we ought to allow these technologies to transform us on a fundamental level and to restructure society in revolutionary ways, although we have to guard very vigilantly against inhuman degradations of individuality and personal genius and these other characteristics that are quintessentially Promethean. These advancing technologies like genetic engineering, like let's say cybernetic cognitive enhancements that integrate us with some degree of AI, they should all be used to enhance our individuality and amplify our creative potential, not to degrade us into some kind of a hive-minded Borg, species.
The cyberpunk reality, basically, yeah.
Yeah, that's an inhuman post-human condition. I want a superhuman post-human condition. And so in that way, I think that, my archaeofuturism is significantly different from Fai's, although it is an archaeofuturism in that I am affirming our heritage as necessary and calling us to have a monumental conception of history, what Nietzsche and Heidegger call a monumental conception of history, as the basis for further development. And I think that in particular, we need to reaffirm this Promethean ethos of, bold exploration and rebellion against tyranny and, personal genius that the flame of which we see kindled in classical Greece and then reappropriated in the Italian Renaissance. So in that way, there is an archaic dimension to my futurism. And what I'm calling for is the advent of what you could term an archaeo-vanguard, a group of people who have always already been the vanguard. They were the vanguard in the days of Aeschylus. They were the vanguard, in the days of the Italian Renaissance. And now they are called to assume social and political leadership and to guide humanity through the most significant crisis that it will ever have faced in its history. So much for Guillaume Faye and archaeofuturism. Let me say a few words about Alexander Dugin. I've corresponded with Dugin, and I have great respect for him. I think that, compared to what counts for a philosopher in academia today, Dugin is worthy of, immeasurably greater respect as a thinker who is elaborating concepts and making proposals that are at least relevant to the challenges we're facing, in the world today, and that we will be grappling with over the coming generation. So to me, Dugin, his position, his multipolar politics, his Eurasianism is definitely part of the conversation and a significant contender for defining I was about to say postmodern paradigm. That requires some elaboration later. We'll put a pin in it. And especially when you consider the influence that he has in among the Russian political elite and with Vladimir Putin himself, I'd say that, Dugin is among the most prominent philosophers of our time. That having been said, from Dugin's perspective, I'm the Antichrist. My thinking epitomizes what Dugin means by Atlanticism. So, Dugin has this sense that we need to maintain multiple poles of civilization in the world. In a way, it's consistent with Samuel Huntington's view of the clash of civilizations. He thinks that Russia is the core state of a Eurasian civilization that extends from Eastern Europe through Central Asia, and that the other major civilizations of the world are the Islamic, the Chinese, the Western civilization, and possibly a Hindu-Indian civilization. And he thinks that we should find a way to move beyond this, unipolar, NATO-dominated Western political paradigm into a multipolar world order beyond neoliberal globalization, where each civilization has its own sphere of influence, and there's a kind of détente between civilizations. There will, of course, be conflict along the fracture lines, along the fault lines between civilizations, but there will also be a dialogue of civilizations. And I think that Dugin is quite sincere when he advocates a dialogue between civilizations. And I've seen that in particular in terms of his engagement with Iranian thought, an area that I have a lot of background in. So when Dugin reads thinkers like Sohrawardi, the medieval Iranian philosopher Shahab al-Din Sohrawardi, he reads them very seriously, and he is trying to open up a conversation between Sohrawardi and, let's say, certain strands in Russian philosophy. But I think that, speaking of Russian philosophy, Dugin, to some extent, and this is I know this is going to come across as a terribly arrogant remark to make, but I think Dugin, to some extent, misunderstands his own culture. When we talk about Russian philosophy, we also have to think of the Russian futurists, the Russian cosmists, people like Nikolai Fyodorov or Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. These people were no less futuristic and cosmic in their perspective than Marinetti and his associates. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was the father of the Russian rocketry program, and he had a vision of the eugenic transformation of humanity into a superhuman race of cosmonauts that colonized, the entire galaxy. And I think that people like Tsiolkovsky, who are really Nietzschean in their thinking, or people like Nikolai Berdyaev, whose whole philosophical project is about freedom and individuality and personal genius and the cultivation of the individual. They are as important in Russian thought as some of these more collectivist, Eurasian tendencies that are highlighted by Dugin. And when the rubber hits the road, when it comes down to practical considerations over the next 30 years, I think that his multipolar model is simply unworkable, because the singularity level technologies that we're confronting are all global in their transformative power. There is no way that you are going to be able to contain the technological singularity if the Chinese decide to pursue these technical developments in a way that brings it about. If the Chinese use genetic engineering to splice human and animal genes, and they become the progenitors of an inhuman race of chimeras on the planet, the effects of that are not going to be contained to China. They're going to affect the rest of humanity. If the Chinese develop an unethical artificial intelligence that they intend to task with running certain aspects of their government, which is a prospect taken very seriously, I can tell you these days in Silicon Valley, that the Chinese are going to hand over, secretly of course, they're going to hand over certain aspects of the control of their government to an artificial intelligence. If they do that, there's no way that, Putin or, I don't know, the president of Iran or, whatever other leader of a different civilization, of a different civilizational core state is going to stop the Chinese from doing that. You have to have a global response to a challenge that faces humanity as a whole. And this is why I would say that the universalism of Prometheism is much more appropriate than the kind of multipolar civilizational politics that Dugin is advocating. Dugin's model will only work if there is a engineered collapse of industrial civilization. If Prometheus forbid, certain cynical traditionalist people within the military industrial intelligence complex do take apart our advanced industrial civilization and we wind up in some kind of a Mad Max world, then yes, Dugin's model would be workable. But otherwise, I don't think so.
I think that he's not only a philosopher, but he also dances on the edge between conspiracy theory and ontology, and that makes him especially attractive to a lot of people. And from what I've seen, I don't know how to explain this, but the fourth political theory and Eurasianism is really having a rise in Latin America, which is something really interesting, Jason, when you think about it. I've never seen, socially, basically Marxism-Leninism was the last really popular political thing to happen in Latin America, and now it's Eurasianism.
I have to say, and I'm just saying this off the cuff in spontaneous response to your remark, I don't think that will last. I think that Latin America's future belongs to the West. I don't see Argentina following some kind of a Russia that sees its destiny as aligned with Kazakhstan and that considers the Mongol heritage in Russia as an important factor in identity. I just don't see Argentina and Chile or Brazil going along with that. I think that they're going to be aligned with where Europe and America go. And when I say Europe, I mean mostly Eastern and Central Europe, because Western Europe is largely lost and will need to be liberated.
It will either be liberated, if I might take the freedom to say, I have a different prediction about what will happen. My prediction is that there will be a massive exodus of what remains of native Western Europeans towards the Balkans and towards Eastern Europe, where they will end up as refugees, or maybe even the inner territorial plains of Russia, where they will resettle and maybe do a demographic miracle to turn the tides. Somehow, Jason, I don't know if you would agree with me or not, somehow I can see that happening in the next 20 years.
I do agree with you. I'll say two things about that. Number one, it's not mutually exclusive to my saying that those places will be liberated. These will be two successive phases. You will have the refugee movements, but then you will also have, I mean, you know, this is typical in histories of countries that are militarily occupied by a hostile power. You have exodus take place, and then you have like the French Free Army or whatever. You know, you have liberation movements develop among the exiled population, and they go back and reconquer their homeland. These things have happened before, and I think that it can happen in Western Europe. But another reason why I think you're right, that there will be this exodus from Western Europe, is that there's a very real prospect of a new ice age in Western Europe and in North America. There is a model of catastrophic climate change, which involves the shutdown of the North Atlantic Current. The North Atlantic Current, you know, which brings warm water up from the Caribbean to the coast of the northeastern United States and to Western Europe, and keeps the temperatures warm in those areas, and these areas habitable and capable of agriculture. That current is basically pumped by the differential between salt water and fresh water in the North Atlantic. And if suddenly you have a massive melt of fresh water from the Greenland ice sheet into the North Atlantic, you're going to shut off the North Atlantic current, and it will cause the polar region to drop by hundreds of kilometers, which will make conditions in France and England and the lowlands of Northern Europe and even parts of Spain similar to the conditions in Alaska today. And so I think for that reason you will also see an exodus of the European population to Eastern Europe, and more so even, frankly, to the Americas. And this is another reason why I don't think that Eurasianism has a future in Latin America, because there will be another wave. I think this is like now going to be the third wave of European immigration to Latin America. The first was in the 19th century. There was after the initial colonization by the Spaniards and the Portuguese, then there was another wave in the 1800s, then one, after the Second World War, and then there will be another one, I think in the 2030s or so, as a result of climate change and the Islamist takeover of European metropolitan areas.
That's already happening. So would you agree with me that to a certain degree, the complete collapse of social order is inevitable in Western Europe to a certain degree?
Absolutely. Not to a certain degree. It will be catastrophic. It will be catastrophic. And, well, look, I lost my career for making this prediction and being surreptitiously recorded in a pub, making a prediction that was misconstrued by splice and dice editors at the New York Times. To look as if it were a prescription rather than a prediction. But yes, I made this prediction, and I'll repeat it again. This will lead to the resurgence of fascism in Europe, period. Now, the question is, what kinds of political paradigms and, what kind of metaphysical and epistemological framework can we develop so that this reactionary right-wing resurgence in Europe does not tend toward the most regressive currents of thought on the right, like traditionalism.
Totalitarian thought, basically.
Yeah.
A new darkness, medieval 2.0.
That's right.
I do genuinely believe with you, and this is something like you don't need to move along intellectual circles in the Balkans or into Eastern Europe. If you go into a Serbian village, right, and you have a conversation with someone who has a good set of mental faculties, but he never received the necessary analytical skills in order to predict the future based on what's happening at the moment. They'll just watch the news, and a Serbian old grandpa, 60 or 70 years of age, will tell you it's causa perdida, it's lost cause. It's gonna happen. It's definitely gonna happen. Now, why they're considering us saying that that's a possibility to be a complete anathema, I don't know, but it goes well with the narrative of multiculturalism. You know, it's all gonna be rainbow unicorns and a beautiful place of tolerance and stuff, etc., etc. We all know how the narrative goes, but it's not happening. Now, in regards to, just let me know how your time is. I want to be respectful towards your schedule.
No, I'm here. I'm at your disposal.
That's amazing. I have been having these conversations with other people from the Warden Post and other circles, right? I recently read a book about the American nations. And I don't know if you're familiar with it. It left quite a remark on me that secessionism in America and regrouping and the emergence of new state entities is quite possible. I really want to hear your opinion about any possible scenarios happening into the United States of America, state fragmentation, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I think it's a very real danger. And frankly, if the identity politics multiculturalist left, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, if they continue tearing down statues of the founding fathers of the United States, not just Confederate statues, statues of the founders of the United States and statues of Union generals who gave their lives fighting the Confederacy, who burned down cities like Atlanta, okay, in order to secure the liberation of slaves. If they continue to attack statues of abolitionist political leaders like Abraham Lincoln, then we are going to wind up in a situation where there is secessionism in this country, and the United States will not survive as a cohesive political entity. So there's a very clear way in which this could take place, and that's that. I mean, okay, there are two scenarios, I would say, going forward. One is the scenario where President Trump is reelected in November, and there are protests and riots in cities on a scale that make what's happening right now look like a firecracker. It will be an inferno in response to the reelection of President Trump. And then, he really may follow through on his threat to declare martial law and bring the military onto the streets of various American cities. If the president sends the military into cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, I think it's very possible that you will see the Cascadian independence movement in the Pacific Northwest and the California Republic independence movement transition into legitimate secessionist movements. And there will be a struggle between, let's say, the California National Guard under the command of Governor Newsom and the United States military. Or, the National Guards of Washington and Oregon State against the United States military. And you could see a Republic of Cascadia and a California Republic break off of the United States on the Pacific coast. And I think those would probably be the first secessions under that scenario. And then you might see New England follow suit. All the states from basically Connecticut and Vermont, all the way up to New Hampshire and Maine. They have a cohesive identity, a New England identity, and they could break off of the United States. And finally, you would see New York and New Jersey as a kind of Gotham Republic, I would call it. Everything is integrated.
That's quite a dark prospect, Jason.
Yeah, everything in New York and New Jersey is integrated. If you live here, you know that. In the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the New York City, Newark, New Jersey megalopolis is really the core of what could become a Gotham Republic. But then, my friend, think about this. What's left of the United States at that point? The Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America.
The Deep South, Appalachia,
and the Rockies, and the Libertarian Rockies. So you will have now all these, yeehaw, identity politics people, Yahoo, Yankee, multiculturalists don't realize that by splitting off of the United States, they're going to yield a nuclear-armed, right-wing, neo-Confederate superpower in the world.
Which might eventually... we might end up being the strongest of all the new established state entities, and they by force reintegrating the rest of them into a new American reality, right?
Well, either that or you know what? There could be other interesting possibilities. Instead of trying to reintegrate Seattle and San Francisco, that future Confederate States of America may decide to integrate Poland and Serbia. Who knows what could evolve from out of that?
Actually, that makes more sense.
Think about it. I mean, because the NATO structure at that point would be focused on this new neo-Confederate America. And, given the Islamization of Western Europe and the kind of social collapse that we were talking about in Western Europe, it's not going to be long that those nations will remain in this military alliance with now a neo-Confederate America. So instead, what will be left of NATO is Central and Eastern Europe. And you would have this basically political entity that extended from the South Atlantic in North America all the way into Eastern Europe, and probably includes parts of Latin America. So that's one scenario for the collapse of the United States. There's another scenario for the disintegration of the United States of America, and that's if Joe Biden somehow manages to become president.
Prometheus forbid.
Prometheus forbid, right? I mean, really, Prometheus, the deity of forethought and of intellect and of of genius, forbid that this geriatric retard who voted for the Iraq War should become president. But if he does, there will not be the kind of rapid push towards secessionism as in the scenario where Trump wins and martial law has to be declared and so forth. But what you'll see is as the multiculturalists, as the identity politics advocates, Antifa, BLM, are institutionalized and start to determine policy in the blue states, what you'll see is a backlash from various right-wing groups across the red states in America, similar to the Ruby Ridge incident, to Waco, Texas, so-called domestic terrorism like Timothy McVeigh's attack on the Oklahoma City federal building. You will see those kinds of flare-ups from right-wing secessionists and rebels, but on steroids. It'll be like what happened in the Clinton era times 10. And eventually it will draw federal forces into the red states in order to suppress these right-wing rebellions, and then an armed uprising against the federal government on the part of, evangelicals and libertarians in the South and in the Western states, in the Rocky Mountain states. And there, it's the neo-Confederacy that will secede from an increasingly identity politics-driven United States. So that's scenario number 2. And I think both of these are very real possibilities. And one of the reasons that I launched Prometheism when I did, from out of this coronavirus crisis and in the midst of these massive uprisings, is because I think it's time and past time to begin developing a viable alternative that will prevent the disintegration of the United States, and that will carve out a political ideology and a spiritual orientation that's beyond the dichotomy of left and right, and that is beyond this dominance of Western spiritual life by the Abrahamic revelations for the past 2,000 years.
Does Christianity have a future into this order, Jason? I know it might be a delicate question, simply because a lot of people on the traditional right might associate themselves either with Orthodox Christianity or pre-1962 Vatican 2.0 Catholicism, so Catholicism with a capital C. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that that such a worldview has a place for Christianity in it as an offshoot of Abrahamic theology, so to speak?
I think that Christianity is a ineradicable phase in the development of Western civilization. Nietzsche understood this very well. What Prometheus means when Shelley calls Frankenstein the modern Prometheus is very different from what Prometheus meant to Aeschylus. What Lucifer means to John Milton in Paradise Lost is inconceivable without Christianity as a catalytic agent. So, just like Nietzsche, I also think that we should never attempt to lobotomize Western identity in a way that would excise Christianity in order to effect a simple return to paganism, a neo-paganism that acts as if, the Christian Middle Ages never happened, is not a progressive or future-oriented movement. A futuristic spiritual reorientation of the West has to take Christianity into account as a force of dialectical transformation in a Hegelian sense. The Prometheism that I'm advocating would not have been possible but for the legacy of Christianity and the way in which, as Nietzsche put it, it immeasurably deepened the Western soul and made it capable both of a greater depth of suffering and also a more infinite vision, a more cosmic vision. So Christianity has to be recognized and honored as a catalytic agent that was integral to the evolution of the consciousness of our Promethean civilization. That's what I would say. Now, to bring it back to the ground on a more practical level, that was very abstract. To bring it back down to the ground and connect it to these predictions of the future that we were just discussing, I would say that various types of Christianity are going to fare better or worse during this coming crisis. And I'd say the one that's going to face the most catastrophic and precipitous collapse is the evangelical Christianity of the southern United States. They're just basically going to be destroyed. And because you see, to them, there is no positive way to integrate these advancing technologies. They reject wholesale, even, in vitro fertilization, and they're bombing abortion clinics and are against stem cell research. What are they going to do when we need to keep up with Chinese genetic engineering? And when in order for students to function, they will have to have had their IQ enhanced when they were embryos being screened for implantation. They just are utterly incapable of grappling with the realities of singularity level technologies in any kind of a constructive way. And I think that in the event that we're able to promote Prometheism and really get this social project off the ground, it will inevitably be branded by them as Satanism. There's no question that they will see this as a basically political platform for the Antichrist.
Dugin has the same problem, and the Eurasianists in general. It's exactly the same problem. Exactly, you described their problem there, not only the evangelical one.
I understand what you're saying, and to a large extent, I agree with you. I would say the evangelicals are in an even worse situation because here's why. Yes, Russian Orthodox thought has a similar tendency to brand the Promethean as the satanic, and to be extremely conservative in terms of technological development. But interestingly enough, and perhaps ironically, Russian cosmism came from out of Russian Orthodoxy. Nikolai Fyodorov and the first generation of Russian cosmists were Russian Orthodox thinkers. So somehow there is a developmental matrix in Russian Orthodoxy which is capable of a mutation and evolution beyond Orthodoxy that is simply impossible in the context of American evangelical Christianity. So I would say the evangelicals will do worse. The Russian Orthodox will not do so well either. They're going to be the second group of Christians to go in this scenario. They'll hang on a little bit longer than the evangelicals. And the ones who will do best will be the Catholic Church. Because, Lucifer loved those people. They just know how to adapt to anything. And I bet you that by the middle of the 21st century, they will have canonized Giordano Bruno as a saint. The same Giordano Bruno that they burned in a public square in Rome, mark my words, they're going to canonize him as a saint. And they will do everything in their power to adapt. I mean, a few years back, the chief astronomer of the Vatican, came out and said that, yes, the universe is full of extraterrestrial intelligences, and by the way, they're our brothers. So clearly, they are preparing to adapt in some very significant ways.
So instead of having this prediction that Catholicism in a way will die off as a denomination and Orthodoxy will rise, we find ourselves about the prospect that call it religious Darwinism, if you want it, in a way, literally the survivors of the fittest. It's actually the other way around. If Catholicism is successful in adapting, it might be the only denomination left compared to evangelical and the Orthodox denominations.
I don't think Catholicism will survive, but it will survive for longer. And in the case of Catholicism, if they do things like canonize Bruno and canonize Teilhard de Chardin, that's another one. Teilhard de Chardin, in his lifetime, the author of the Phenomenon of Man and the thinker of the omega point concept and so forth, he was a Jesuit paleontologist and philosopher who was sidelined as a heretic in his own time. If they canonize Teilhard de Chardin's thought as part of the scholastic tradition of the Catholic Church, by making moves like this, they will transition to something that at some point is just not even Christianity anymore. And, they're going to wind up eventually saying things like, well, Lucifer also reflects the divine light. And, they're going to understand Lucifer the way that Carl Jung understands Lucifer in terms of archetypal psychology, and as an archetype that is in a kind of dialectical relationship to the Christ figure. So that's what I see. It's possible for the Catholic Church. Of course, it depends on the concrete political decisions that they make. And the more they entrench themselves and the more conservative and recalcitrant they are, the more they will face the kind of violent breakup that you will see, and implosion that you will see in some of the other denominations of Christianity.
When we're discussing all of these topics, somehow I come to the notion, Jason, that I actually don't want to see a world without the United States of America as a major player in geopolitical agendas. In a way, a lot of people will say that America is the great Satan, for example, and so on, which is apparently not the case. For me, although
America is the great Satan. Look, I'm an Iranian by paternal descent. So, my fatherland invented the discourse that America is the great Satan. And I think that Ayatollah Khomeini was exactly right. America is the great Satan. In the same sense that evangelical Christians consider Prometheus to be Satan. The Promethean genius of America, that kind of will toward bold exploration, visionary futurism.
Faustian inquisitorialism, yeah.
Yes, and the remaking of man as a god, right? The humanity becoming self-made and taking control of its own destiny and remaking itself. I mean, this is the symbolic meaning of the fact that Prometheus is the engineer of man, and that he made man to supersede the Olympian gods. Our destiny is to become gods who kneel and bow to no other gods. This is the essence of American individualism and enterprise and, cultural creativity.
Call it American exceptionalism, in other words.
Absolutely. And so Ayatollah Khomeini, from his conservative...
Hello? I think we lost each other for a second there because of internet connection or something. Yes, I do apologize for everyone who might be watching. Let's keep in touch and see what's happening. I think it might be just an internet connection problem. Well, we lost Jason. I think he should be back with us. Things like this can certainly happen, especially in times like this when we heavily rely on technology and person-to-person meetings are not possible. Right, that seems to be a good solution to our issues. Hopefully Jason will be able to rejoin us back into our humble virtual studio in a second. So welcome back, Jason. It can happen.
I just can't catch a break. The last interview I tried to do with Unslaved, at the end of the interview, the whole system crashed and they lost 70% of our interview. I don't know what the hell is going on over here. At any rate, I'm glad to be back. This is what happens when you start calling America the Great Satan.
You took the words out of my mouth. That was something which was running on my mind, actually. It's like there are things where there are rabbit holes we shouldn't be visited.
I'm telling you.
Oh, definitely, man. I completely agree with you. But yeah, we were talking about the USA. Now, the whole situation, Jason, honestly speaking, I will repeat myself again just to emphasize how important it is that a world without the United States of America will not be a nice, juicy place to live in. And this is something people have a problem on the understanding, especially people who are on the... Now, I personally don't have anything against them, but this is something the Eurasianist agenda is blind to. Like, what do you think will happen to Russia, which is a regional power, let's say in a situation where America is out of the picture, and then you have an increasingly aggressive China, which doesn't have any cultural relation or any other point which relates it to Russia or the West of the West?
Look, this is why in world state of emergency, as I'm sure you're aware, I proposed an alliance between America, Europe, Russia, Iran, India, and Japan against China and against Sunni Islam. So I don't see any reason why the United States of America and Russia cannot be aligned and evolve together toward a shared Promethean future. There is much in the Russian philosophical tradition that is Promethean in spirit, because you have to consider that besides the Russian cosmists, who were very Promethean in their outlook, particularly Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who actually worked with the Soviet government despite his eugenics advocacy. They cut him slack, and he was basically the Jack Parsons of the Soviet rocket program. Besides the Russian cosmist version of Prometheism that you see in Russia, you also have the Promethean impulse in Marxism. And there was a lot in Soviet communism that, and I know people on the right are going to be rubbed the wrong way by this, but there was a lot in Soviet communism that was Promethean, and it really futurist and developmental in nature. I mean, they had their own titanic vision of what they called the new man, a kind of Soviet version of the Übermensch that they were.
Absolutely. It was one of the most anthropocentric ideologies ever to exist, and it is a literal fusion between this cosmism and Marxist doctrine on the other hand. You're absolutely spot on there.
So I don't see any reason why Russia cannot regain that and continue to evolve in a Promethean trajectory together with America, and then they converge at some point in a future, Prometheus world society. We have to ally against China and against the Sunni Caliphate. These are the two great enemies of everything Promethean that, I am affirming and calling for us to base our future society on. And in that conflict, Iran is also very important. And I've spent a lot of time, belaboring that point, that even the current Islamic Republic of Iran can evolve in a nationalist direction toward a resurgence of Persian identity, combined with a Shiaism that sets Iran into an antagonistic stance with the Sunni Caliphate, with the new rising Sunni Caliphate. Even under the Islamic Republic, Iran can evolve into a type of society and nation that would be allied with both Russia and the West against Sunni Islam and China.
That absolutely makes sense. I think that people are underestimating China. A lot of people will tell you, I have the notion that they just want to be left alone to devise their own agendas. They're not aggressive. No, it's actually one of the worst aggression possible. It's a subliminal aggression. It's in a way, honestly, if we lived in a parallel society where we have a situation of China taking over as a world hegemon, right? Without any other alternative poles in dictating geopolitical occurrences and what will be happening internally around different civilizational blocks, I think we're talking about a ruthless, technocratic, cold, void of any metaphysical meaning end of history. That's going to be it pretty much.
You're absolutely right.
Because imagine that situation, Jason, with them engineering themselves genetically in accordance with all the technological advancements when they become a different species biologically in 100 years or so. It's the end of history.
I agree.
And I'm not talking in the Fukuyama end of history sense. I'm talking about, if you're familiar with the alternative history fiction of Sterling, the Draka Domination trilogy. This is the type of end of history I'm talking about.
They will become a hive-minded, inhuman species that diverges from Homo sapiens. Chinese culture is extremely collectivistic, and if you imagine, that they would tinker with various elements of human personality using genetic engineering, they will wind up emphasizing the collectivist traits that are characteristic of their civilization. And on the other hand, we're dealing with, one of the most high IQ populations on the planet, as it is. It's possible to increase IQ by about 15 points per generation just using embryo selection without even genetic engineering, just using pre-implantation embryo screening and PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis of embryos. You can select for the highest IQ child that you would have with your prospective mate by 15 points per generation. And if the Chinese start to do that in the next 10 years, I don't know, by the second half of the 21st century, you're going to be dealing with a 140, 160, IQ average population. And how are we going to outcompete them at that point? We have to nip it in the bud.
And can you imagine the vista of opportunities for personality disorders being developed from such a psychological state? Something like which makes contemporary sociopathy and psychopathy like a child's play. Now we're talking about acting as different species, exploiting aggressively without any kind of moral limitation. We're not talking moral limitation from a Judeo-Christian perspective here. I'm talking about slave master morality, literally.
Okay. You talk about Chinese and slave master. I really shouldn't say this, but I'll say it. I have a tendency to do that. The Africans thought they had it bad with European colonialists. I don't know if you've been watching the African reaction to Chinese business ventures in Africa. Oh my gods. I mean, the Africans, they realize what racism is and what oppression really means. The way the Chinese are colonizing Africa right now and treating the native population, it makes the European colonialists in Africa, frankly, look like beneficent, humanitarians.
So we're talking Joseph Conrad on steroids, basically.
That's right. Let me just leave it at that. And when you talk to the Chinese about what their views are of the Africans that they are working on these projects with, power, energy generation, mining projects, railroad projects. Oh God, you want to find some racism? Go talk to the Chinese about what they really think of the Africans they're working with right now. So yes, it's very dangerous to allow the Chinese to have a monopoly on these singularity level technologies, whether it's genetic engineering, AI, or whatever else.
Yeah, and somehow they have suppressed any kind of cultural subversion by, it is a one-party totalitarian state. China is a totalitarian state. Anyone thinking otherwise has to recheck his ABCs in political science, right? But realistically speaking,
China is a totalitarian state in a way that is not even possible in the West. In the West, you can have political totalitarianism, but you're always going to be resisting the Western individual. Western civilization is in the end a civilization based around the human individual. And this is one of the reasons why Dugin, for example, tries to distinguish Eurasia from the West, which he says is, suffers from a kind of Faustian individualism. So in the West, however totalitarian a political structure becomes, it will eventually be undone by the rebellious individual. In China, totalitarianism has a much more organic character because it is grounded in the personality profile of the Chinese population on average and is in tune with the collectivist tendencies of their culture going back to antiquity.
This is where Francis Fukuyama explicitly elaborates on this question in his Magnum Muslims, The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay. He points out that China has been, like, the way they basically adopted Marxism to an already existing Confucian framework. That's exactly what they did. And people will tend to talk like, yeah, but this is the new China. No, this is a China with different aesthetics. China has always been what you actually see now. And this is something people are quite ignorant towards, not knowing enough about state building and institutions in China.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you entirely.
Right. So we have explored quite a lot of topics, Jason. And I think if we continue further, we could go on without breaks or ending.
Let's save it for another conversation. Hopefully, this will be the beginning of many future conversations. And I look forward to all of them.
I definitely do the same. As I said, do you have any... I don't want to conclude such an amazing and thought-provoking conversation with China. I don't want China to be the last topic. So I'll pass the ball on your part of the court and say, like, do you have any parting words, or do you want to conclude?
Sure. So okay, we don't want to end with China. So let's shift slightly in the Pacific to Japan. Anyone who's read Prometheus and Atlas knows that I have very high regard for the Japanese culture. And I think that unlike in China, in Japan, you do find this very odd Promethean streak that is not characteristic by any means of the majority of the Japanese population. It is not the mainstream. But there is a subculture. There is a kind of Japanese counterculture that is Promethean in its ethos, and it's produced the whole phenomenon of Japanese anime and manga, science fiction Japanese anime and manga, some of which is very philosophically sophisticated, like Neon Genesis Evangelion or Akira. I think that Russia could be an important bridge between the Japanese and the West. And instead of this Eurasianist vision that Dugin has for Russia's future, which I think is a vision that forsakes the future, I would advocate a Russian civilizational bridge between the Japanese and the West. And a way of integrating the Japanese into the Prometheus project that America will be the bastion of. In a way, Japan is strangely positioned between Russia and America. And Japan can also, I think, as a result, function as a cultural and political bridge between the Americans and the Russians as we work toward a Prometheus future world society.
That is a very realistic prospect, Jason. I would add that I completely agree with you, and I have been thinking on the same lines, especially knowing a lot of people from Japan. I would even dare to say that in a lot of aspects of their spiritual existence, they're more Faustian than many Europeans I know today.
Absolutely.
So that's a fact about Japan. And just I'm a deep admirer of the literary work of Yukio Mishima, and you can see that through his works. They're profoundly Spenglerian in notion, even. So whoever hasn't done that, I highly recommend any books of Mishima. And I would close this episode of MetaVisions by saying thank you very much. It means a lot for me and for the rest of the guys to have you on the podcast here. You're a tremendous intellectual guidance and a profound influence on the entire project. Not for all of us, but for some of us. Of course, we have some people who tend to be more Judeo-Christian in observing things, but we tend to agree to disagree, and we'll leave it there.
Thank you. It was absolutely my pleasure, Alex. And again, I look forward to many future conversations.
Absolutely. For all of you, you can find Dr. Jorjani's books on the official website of Arctis Media Limited or on Amazon. Feel free to check all the links I have in the description if you haven't liked the Prometheanism website. And stay tuned for a future episode of Playing with Dangerous Ideas. Thank you very much once more, Jason.
Thank you, Alex. Take care.
See you. Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.